A few years after the Second World War ended, Winston Churchill told his private secretary,
"No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress, as I did those of President Roosevelt."
Churchill was reflecting on the most famous transatlantic relationship in history. Its popular image, and Churchill's own depiction, is of a golden age of collaboration. A far-sighted American president is seduced by the bravery and eloquence of a beleaguered prime minister and rides to his rescue. But this rosy picture is largely myth. On May the 10th, 1940, on a bright spring morning in Washington, President Roosevelt called a meeting of his cabinet to discuss astonishing news coming in from Europe. Nazi forces were smashing into France, Holland, and Belgium. In Britain, there was political turmoil. Harold Ickes, the American Secretary of the Interior, was a senior member of Roosevelt's government.
While we were at Cabinet, word was brought in that Chamberlain had resigned. The President said that he supposed that Churchill was the best man that England had, even if he was drunk half of his time.
That evening, Churchill became British Prime Minister. A few days later, he told his son, Randolph, there was only one way to beat Hitler.
"I shall drag in the United States."
Little did Churchill know that his entire strategy for winning the war depended on seducing a man who not only thought him a drunk, but also held a dislike for him that stretched back more than 20 years. Privately, Roosevelt told the American ambassador to Britain, Joseph Kennedy,
"I have always disliked him since the time I went to England in 1918. I'm giving him attention now because there is a strong possibility that he will become Prime Minister, and I want to get my hand in now."
The first test of the relationship between these men, who had so little in common, took place in the intense crucible of Hitler's blitzkrieg. Churchill told Roosevelt that Britain's very survival could depend on the immediate loan of 50 American destroyers, mothballed since the First World War. The next day, Roosevelt refused him. Churchill's first request had resulted in instant disappointment. But for the president, the loan was too big a political risk. The United States was still a land at peace, trying to enjoy life, and bound by neutrality laws. Then, 3 weeks later, the Italian dictator Mussolini entered the war. Roosevelt had asked Mussolini to keep out. That night, he showed his anger.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, the hand that held the dagger has struck it into the back of its neighbor.
But on June the 17th, France surrendered to the Nazis. Roosevelt believed that Britain too could go under. There was no point in trying to rescue a drowning man. Just days after the promise of help, he slammed the door shut.
The 19th of June. President R has turned down our demand for 40 destroyers. We need them badly.
This time, Roosevelt, on much safer political ground, said yes. But to keep the United States Congress happy, he insisted on a legal agreement under which Britain, in return for the destroyers, gave America 99-year leases on military bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. Churchill did not mind the Americans having the bases, but felt humiliated that it should be made to appear a trade. In a transatlantic phone call with the American Attorney General, Robert Jackson, he remarked,
Empires just don't bargain.
Jackson replied,
Republics do.
it was the first tiny dent in Churchill's beloved empire. But the value in morale was priceless. Announcing the destroyer deal to the House of Commons, he was jubilant.
The 20th of August. The PM ended his speech by comparing Anglo-American cooperation, will it one day be unity, to the Missouri River and saying, "Let it roll on." I drove back with him in the car and he sang Old Man River, out of tune, the whole way back to Downing Street.
Churchill pleaded for massive American aid. Within his long cable to Roosevelt was one short, stark sentence.
7th of December. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies.
In fact, Roosevelt had already decided to help. He'd just been re-elected President of the United States for an unprecedented third term. But while a vocal minority of Americans wanted to have nothing to do with Europe's war, the majority wished to help. Churchill told John Colville,
The important element is the boldness of the President. He will lead opinion and not follow it. He does not want war, but he will not shrink from war.
even more encouragement came from a second American visitor to London, Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate defeated in the presidential election. Willkie gave Churchill a handwritten message from Roosevelt.
I think this verse applies to your people as it does to us. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union strong and great. Humanity with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate.
To Churchill, the obvious meaning was that the president was preparing to fight side by side with him. But when Willkie returned to Washington, the first question Roosevelt asked him about Churchill was,
Is he a drunk?
Lend-Lease could only work if supplies were shipped safely across the Atlantic. Some in Roosevelt's cabinet privately urged him to allow American ships to form armed convoys. Roosevelt rebuffed them. Churchill pleaded with Roosevelt for more help to stop the Nazis.
At this moment, much hangs in the balance. I feel Hitler may quite easily now gain vast advantages very cheaply, and we are so fully engaged that we can do little or nothing to stop his spreading himself.
Then he sketched a world in which Hitler dominated all Europe, Asia and Africa, and left the US and ourselves no option but an unwilling peace.
In desperation, Churchill told Roosevelt he must come to his rescue.
Mr. President, the one decisive counterweight I can see would be if the United States were immediately to range herself with us as a belligerent power.
It was a year since Churchill had become Prime Minister, and he was back to square one, on bended knees to Roosevelt, begging him to join the fight, threatening disaster if he didn't. The evasiveness of the man on whom he had pinned everything was dashing all his hopes. Several of Roosevelt's most senior cabinet members were in mutinous mood at the president's apparent inertia. On May the 12th, 1941, the Interior Secretary, Harold Ickes, organized a secret meeting with the War Secretary, Henry Stimson, the Attorney General, Bob Jackson, and the Navy Secretary, Frank Knox. Ickes noted in his diary,
I had called this meeting to see to what extent the men mentioned would be willing to join in some written representation to the President. All of us found ourselves in complete agreement. None of us could account for the President's failure of leadership.
2 days later, another senior cabinet member, the Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, recorded in his diary a meeting with Harry Hopkins, the man closest to Roosevelt.
Hopkins said the President has never said so in so many words, but he thinks the President is loath to get us into this war, and he would rather follow public opinion than lead it.
Goebbels' boss, Adolf Hitler, let Roosevelt off his hook. At dawn on June the 22nd, 1941, 3 million Nazi troops advanced into Russia. Churchill breathed an enormous sigh of relief.
Sunday, June the 22nd, 1941. On going to bed, the PM kept on repeating how wonderful it was that Russia had come in against Germany when she might so easily have been with her.
To Churchill, the invasion showed more than ever Hitler's global ambitions and could only compel Roosevelt to draw nearer to war. But Roosevelt drew a different, more subtle conclusion. He quickly calculated that Russia's forced entry into the war could help America continue to stay out. Instead, Russia could be a second nation to be financed to fight Germany.
When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him.
Then, in the sinking of a third American destroyer, over 100 crew died in the USS Reuben James. Churchill sent Roosevelt his condolences. Roosevelt never had the slightest intention. Churchill's great hope had been an illusion. Even Lend-Lease had made practically no difference. It only provided 1% of Britain's weapons in its lonely year of 1941. Then, on December the 7th, the Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt was brutally hurled into war.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Even now, Roosevelt did not ask Congress to declare war against Japan's ally, Germany. As it turned out, he was saved the choice. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. 1942, a year when the war was still going badly, was their honeymoon period. But it couldn't and wouldn't last. In the end, Churchill lost his duel with Roosevelt. He failed to persuade him to bring America into the war. Japan and Hitler did that. What this meant was that Roosevelt was not fighting Churchill's war, but his own. And the two men had very different long-term objectives. But he let Roosevelt know that he would resign over India if he was pushed too far. And there was a second gulf between them. Britain had gone to war for the freedom of Europe, specifically the independence of Poland. But as 1942 wore on, Churchill was beginning to see a new threat to Europe. The man who'd become the third ally in the fight against Hitler, Joseph Stalin. These opposing views held the seeds of increasingly bitter disagreements. The third duel of the warlords would be between Churchill and Stalin. At stake was the future liberty of Europe. The casualty of that duel would be the trust Churchill had worked so hard to build with his new friend across the Atlantic.